Now available in paperback and e-readers, ISIS Legacy. The sorority secrets of the goddess next door are revealed in this all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS Legacy in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. In a previous video, I talked about why it's impossible to save DC Comics. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the amount of work that it would be needed to fix DC Comics from a publisher's perspective. Now, I've been a publisher of SJS Direct for over a decade, and I have been a writer for over 30 years. And over that course of 30 years, I have learned how to write comic book scripts, novels, and screenplays, as I've published over 80 books on the SJS Direct imprint. And from my decade of experience being a publisher, I can tell you that your DC Comics has two serious issues that would lead to no one being able to save DC Comics, because the amount of work that would need to be done would be so overwhelming that it just wouldn't be worth that person's time. Now, time is one of the great intangibles as related to DC Comics, and people's time is precious and you just can't get time back. And time is something that would be needed to fix all of the catastrophic damage that has been done to your DC Comics at this point. Now, your DC universe has suffered a catastrophic structural failure as related to the foundations of its universe and its overall story platform. With this catastrophic structural damage done over the course of a decade by your Dan Didio after he decided to reboot the DC universe with the New 52, it is next to impossible for any person who comes in to build any sort of trust with the reader. The audience right now has walked away from DC Comics because the audience just does not trust Editorial to keep the characters consistent, keep the stories consistent, and continue to give them the same types of stories in the DC universe that I received when I picked up DC Comics back in the 90s and in the 80s. Now, back in the 80s and the 90s, it was very easy to pick up a DC comic. Even though there was a Crisis of Infinite Earths, you could still connect the old DC universe with Earth 1, Earth 2, and Earth 3 to the post-Crisis DC universe, and everything was practically easy to follow. For example, I knew that Wally West was the Kid Flash from the old DC Comics, and I was able to easily understand that he had taken over the role of the Flash back when I was a teenager in the late 80s when I first picked up the Flash. And I could also easily figure out that Green Fury from the Global Guardians from a DC Universe Presents book that I had when I was a little kid was something that I could figure out that Fire was originally the Green Fury. Everything was pretty easy to follow at DC Comics, but over the last decade, as we've had multiple crises and multiple reboots, it has become just absolutely impossible to follow everything in the DC universe unless you're a die-hard fan. And that type of structural damage makes it where the old readers have a hard time following the continuity unless they're a die-hard fan, and a new reader gets really frustrated when they start to see, oh, this book, it ended at issue 12, and now I'm going to the back issues trying to find out more about this character, and there's like multiple volumes, so it becomes overwhelming for the customer, and the customer, they can't trust what they have read in the current issue to remain consistent, and they go back to the back issues and they have a hard time following what's in the back issue. So right now you have a major trust issue with the audience, and the audience does not have faith as related to your DC Comics remaining consistent as related to its characters, because one minute a character has one sexual orientation, the next it has another, or one minute this character has one trait of their personality, and the next they have another trait to their personality that wasn't there in previous issues. And this lack of consistency, this is something that does not allow you to foster a relationship with the reader. And when the reader doesn't feel like they can foster a relationship with the characters, what the reader does is say, I'm not going to deal with this, and they put the book back on the shelf and keep it moving. Now, this catastrophic structural damage, it's not something that can easily be repaired by a professional writer. A professional writer, if they come into the DC universe at this point, they face a whole universe that has such structural damage that there's no way they could go out here and repair all of that damage. Now, that damage, as related to DC's inconsistent continuity, was easy to fix with the Crisis of Infinite Earths, and even your Jeff Johns could have gone out here and fixed a lot of that structure with DC's Rebirth. Unfortunately, when Dan Didio came back to control DC Comics, he put such structural damage into DC Comics as related to the storytelling once more that it's just not no creator can go out here and fix any of that damage, because he's just weakened the beams to the point where they cannot hold the weight of this continuity. Now, your DC Comics' continuity, again, it is very cumbersome, and it became even more cumbersome over the last decade. And as this continuity became even more cumbersome, it made DC's books, for the most part, very hard to access, and it made it where you couldn't go from one book to the next outside of a certain family of characters, which were the Batman family. Now, the Batman family books have remained somewhat consistent, and many of the characters still contain many of their character traits that readers knew over the course of 30 years. And the books that perform the strongest, like Nightwing and Batman, continue to do well, whereas other characters, they have, like Batgirl and Tim Drake, have been faltering due to the inconsistent characterizations that they have. And that's the other big problem with DC Comics, is that you have a lot of characters that just are not really connecting, and that's not a good thing for your DC Comics. Now, the big when you have a publisher, you have to have a number of books that sell, because 90% of your books are going to fail, and you need that 10% of books to go out here and sell. Unfortunately, at DC Comics, many of their so-called top sellers are not cracking the top 50, and when you have iconic characters like Superman, Wonder Woman, and The Flash struggling to get sales, that does not bode well for that publisher. And it doesn't bode well for that publisher because when you don't have your top characters selling, it's showing that the audience, there's something wrong, and you're not, resonating with the audience. So your DC Comics is not in a good place as related to its product, and it's not really in a good place as I see it creatively. And it's just the structural damage is so extensive that it's just not worth the time to go in here and fix all of those years of structural damage, because to sit there and try to fix and shore up all of this damage, it just comes to the point where a creator is practically taking years out of their life trying to put DC Comics back together, and that's time that most creators these days are not willing to go out here and spend on a company's intellectual property where they're not going to get any sort of fair compensation. Now, one of the other problems that relates to your DC Comics and its struggles as related to rebuilding is compensation. And most creators these days, they're looking at all of these indie guys going out here and making all of this money on Indiegogo and Kickstarter, and they're looking at DC Comics' page rates, which at the max is about $110 a page for a writer, and only maybe about $200 for a penciler. And they're saying to themselves, why should I sit here and spend all of this money working on trying to fix somebody else's broken character when I can go out here and build my own? And that's what many creators like myself are saying to themselves, why should I spend years of my life trying to fix somebody else's character, fix all of their problems, and then try to go out here and build my own characters afterward, when I can go out here and go directly to the customer and put my own characters out here and build those characters in the marketplace. And as you're out here building your own characters in the marketplace, like what I'm trying to do with the John Haynes character and the characters of the SJS Direct universe, you can go out here and foster a relationship with the customer, and you can go out here and build your own brand with your own customer. So that's the other problem that your DC Comics faces from a creator standpoint. Many creators are looking at it and saying, look, it's just yes, these characters have prestige, but they're just not worth the time to work with, because that time in a career is not something somebody's going to get back. And the whole thing is that when you're DC Comics, that time that you lose working with those characters is time that you could have building your career and your brand with your own characters, and you also get to reap the wealth from owning your own intellectual property. So when I look at your DC Comics from a publisher's perspective, I just see a structurally damaged brand that really reminds me of a totaled 1971 Nova. Yes, it's a classic car with a lot of emotional attachment to a generation. However, when you look at that car from a mechanic's perspective, that car is not something that anybody can repair. And many people, because they have an emotional attachment to the 71 Nova, and they have sentimental memories about the experiences they have in that car, they want to believe that this car can be fixed. But any mechanic or any auto rebuilder, they're going to look at that vehicle that has been completely totaled, and they're going to look at the sum of the parts that are needed to rebuild this vehicle and restore it to functioning condition, and they're going to realize that it costs more than what it's worth. And when I look at DC Comics, I compare it to that totaled 71 Nova that has a crushed roof, has frame damage, and has the front end and the back end completely smashed, rust all throughout the body, and an engine with a blown head gasket. Now, these whole parts, as you look at all the damage that is done, with this car having rust, this car having a frame damage, this car having all sorts of structural issues, and an engine with a blown head gasket, when you tally up the cost of all of the parts needed to go out here and fix that 71 Nova and restore it to running condition, we're not talking about getting it back to being restored to factory standards. We're talking about getting it running. This costs more than the vehicle is actually worth. So most people, when they see a car that is totaled like that, what they do is they just say, at this point, yes, I had great memories in that car. Yes, I really loved this car, and yes, it is a classic, but there's no going out here and me spending more money trying to fix this damaged vehicle, and they sell that vehicle for scrap because there's nothing there that they can do to bring this vehicle back to running condition or even restore it to showroom condition. So that's what I look at DC Comics. Yes, you've got a lot of great characters that you have emotional attachment to, a lot of characters that we had a lot of great memories with. Unfortunately, the DC's universe is not is so structurally damaged. There's no saving the DC universe at this point, because the 2022 DC universe is just not in a place where a creator can come in here with a couple of storylines and practically get these characters back on track, where the entire universe is consistent. Now, yes, you have some good books at DC right now, like Nightwing and The Flash, but many of the core books are struggling. Even Batman, that sells very well, is not the high quality it was during the 90s, when you had writers like Alan Grant on the book, or guys like Doug Mahnke, or you had guys like Chuck Dixon. Your Batman has really suffered, and maybe Chip Zdarsky can do something with Batman to get it back on track. But many of these other DC books are floundering, and they're floundering because one of the big components that you would need to fix DC Comics is a strong editorial. And DC Comics does not have a strong editorial right now, because we've had over a decade and a half of Dan Didio, who practically knew nothing about the publishing business. Then we had your Daniel Cherry come in, and basically he walked right out the door because he saw how broken DC was as a brand. He came in, he came right back out, and your DC right now is a rudderless ship, because nobody wants to take on that overwhelming amount of work that is needed to fix DC Comics, and nobody wants to take that kind of time, because the problem with DC Comics is that what will happen is you'll go out here, rebuild DC Comics, and spend all those years of your career doing this, and then somebody 6 months later will tear everything back down. And many creators and many people in the publishing business look at DC Comics and say, why would I want to spend time out of my career going out here trying to clean up an entire mess that requires dump trucks, wrecking balls, and all sorts of heavy equipment, when you could go out here and build a foundation out here with your own characters, your own stories, and go out here and build your own platform, and also generate wealth for yourself that would be much more than the paltry compensation you would receive for putting in all of that work working to rebuild DC Comics. Because the amount of money that you would get paid to go out here and work at DC Comics, and what you would have to do, it would pale in comparison to the amount of hours you would spend trying to shore up a broken continuity and try to fix all of these all this character damage. I mean, the amount of pay you would get is paltry when you consider the amount of work that would need to be done to get DC Comics back on track. I mean, and you're getting paid at the most $200 a page as an artist, and $110 as a writer, and the writer's job at, again, $110 max. That's nothing compared to what writers can make if they go out here into trade publishing, or they go out here and do indie publishing. That's nothing. I mean, $110 a page, it's just not worth the time to put all of those hours in trying to rebuild this character, because it's just too much work to do. And that's why many people are saying, look, you can't sit there and rebuild these characters because it's just too much work to do. So that's why, from a publisher's perspective, I say you can't save DC Comics, because at this point there's nothing really there to save, because the damage is just too extensive. The damage is just too catastrophic, and there's nothing there as related to structure that you can shore up or is secure. And with nothing there structurally there that can hold up the weight of all of that damaged continuity, it's just not worth the time for a creator to go out here and spend their time trying to clean up all of this mess. And it's just not worth the time that it would take to go out here. And again, time is an intangible that is something you can't get back. And most creators are looking at it and going, the amount of time that I would need to go in here and really get in here and fix a lot of this stuff, it's just not worth the time. I mean, when anybody who's done mechanical work like PC repair or auto mechanics, they know that time is something that relates to your labor, and you have to value your time. But as a writer, I just look at it and go, the amount of hours that would be needed to fix all of that almost 2 decades of damage that was done, it would just not be worth my time as a creator to come in here and go out here and try to fix DC Comics. And it just isn't worth the amount of labor that would be needed. I mean, the whole thing is that with DC's broken continuity and its characters practically being completely out of whack, you would need years to do this. And again, a creator these days, they're looking at their years and saying, hey, if I can get 50 grand on Kickstarter or 20 grand on Kickstarter for a brand new character, that all that money is coming to me. I get to keep all my intellectual property rights, and I don't have to go out here and try to beg someone to look at my work or try to hire me. I'm working for myself. So that's another aspect that, as related to DC Comics, yes, they are the big two these days, Marvel and DC, but the whole thing is that when you have a lot of structural issues, creators don't want to deal with structural issues. Yes, we'll work with a character in their last known good condition, but these characters are not in their last known good condition. A character that is in their last known good condition, yes, you can pick up and start writing that character and start crafting your run, but a character that is not in last known good condition, you have to try to spend 6 to 12 months repairing that character. And just as you're about to repair the character, the sales are not there, so the book gets canceled. So you just wasted a whole 6 to 12 months out of your life writing stories. And again, that goes back to time, and it's just not worth your time. And that's the core part of why people are seeing DC Comics is dead comics, because at this point it's just not worth anybody's time to go in here and try to fix a mess, and it's not worth anybody's time as a creator to try to deal with all of these structural issues and be able to try to shore up a broken structure and then try to wrap form around those rickety pieces, because it's just so much work to do that it becomes overwhelming for a creator, and it's just not worth all the headaches that are involved. And that's why many creators and publishers like myself look at DC Comics and just see a brand that is on its last days. And if it wasn't for the intellectual property value as related to Time Warner and Discovery, your DC Comics would have been gone out of business like Charlton Comics, and we would be looking at the final issues of DC Comics if it wasn't for those corporate bosses practically just using the brand in order to make its movies. And that's why I said that the only reason why DC Comics will remain in print is because of the IP catalog, and what they will do is just use these books to just keep the trademarks relevant and keep the trademarks fresh. And at this point, the books are not really selling the way they used to. So there comes a point in business where they're going to say, look, we're tired of taking losses on these books, and to keep the IP fresh, we're going to possibly maybe do a dozen titles and keep them in print, like a Batman and the Batman family. And the rest of the DC heroes, they may make appearances here and there in miniseries, or they may make appearances in maxi series, or they may just wind up putting them all in a Shonen Jump style book or a compilation book in order to keep the rights but keep the costs low as related to production. So when I look at your DC Comics from a publisher's perspective, the reason why I say that there's no saving DC Comics is because there's just too much work to do to try to shore this up, too much time to work on this type of venture, and many creators and publishers out here, or publishing types, they are more interested in going out here and making their own IPs and generating wealth for themselves rather than watching DC Comics and having the prestige of working on a DC title while they remain in poverty. So your DC Comics, as I see it, again, it's not salvageable at this point. It's basically a totaled vehicle, and it's a totaled vehicle, and it's just in such bad condition that there's no way you can find any salvageable parts. So all you can do, sadly, is watch as this well-known, very popular platform goes to the crusher and meets its demise. Sadly, that is the final fate of DC Comics at this point, and there's nothing anybody that they could really do about it. It's sad to say that it's the end of DC Comics, but this is the end for the brand, and there's nothing anyone can really do about it. If you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to pick up some of my books on the SJS Direct imprint, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, you can find those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBook Store, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. If you think you've seen scares, get ready for the horror of the hyena woman.